Yeah, frost damage can have important impact on trees. If it damages the newly formed needles, it can impact photosynthesis. And if it impacts the apical meristem, it can reduce tree growth. And this can have importance on sustainable forest management because frost is mostly damaging the small trees. And so if it keeps damaging the regeneration, it can have important impact in the long term. But predicting frost is actually quite hard. So determining if there will be more growing season frost in the future is quite difficult. And so I'm going to present some of the results that I got on that. So obviously climate is changing. So in northern ecosystems like in Quebec, the mean annual temperature in 1960, which stands for the MAF, was around 4 degrees Celsius, and the growing degree days, which is the GDD, was around 2,800. But in the north, the mean annual temperature is more of 0.5, and the growing degree days is more of 2,000 degrees, 2,000 growing degree days. But by 2090, it could be projected to reach as high as 11 degrees near Montreal. And in the north, it could reach as high as 8 degrees. These are predictions from the most extreme scenarios. So they're the what of most warming we could expect, but it still could be expected. So it's a very impressive change in temperature, and it has therefore lots of implication and impact on the ecosystem. It can increase droughts, increase fire. It could also increase advanced budbreak. So under warmer climate, trees could open their buds earlier, and if they do so, it can increase the growing season length, and it would favor productivity. But at the same time, the trees could be more exposed to frost, and it could damage them more. So the point is, would tree productivity be favored in a world where there will be more extremes? It's unclear. And also, many phenological models predicting budbreak timing only rely on climate. So basically, if you want to determine when trees will leaf out, you just need air temperature. And the question that I'm asking is more like, are climate models actually accurate? So can we really predict budbreak timing with accuracy? And can we really predict frost with accuracy? And how variability in the climate model can actually impact our interpretation of tree growth and frost. So there are many sources of uncertainty in climate models. The most well-known is about CO2 emission. And the way we deal with that is we have many different scenarios where CO2 emissions are more or less, and this leads to different projection in climate. So there could be lots of warming under lots of CO2 emissions and less warming if we reduce them. A second way to deal with second uncertainty is the physical formulation of climate models. So climate models, there are like many of them. There's not only one, and they all have different slight changes in the way they're built, and that leads to different variation in their outputs. And so many research is now using many climate models, not only one, and these are called multi-model ensemble. And for an example, along the study trend seg that we could show in the map, if I use 5 different climate models, here's the mean annual temperature that is expected at every latitude. And we could see that from the simulation that is the warmest, which is the red one, with the coldest, there could be almost a 2-degree difference. So climate models will vary in their prediction of climate, and variation in 2 degrees is actually quite high. But a third uncertainty that is not very well known right now is called the internal variability of climate models. And actually, climate models can express some chaotic behaviors. So if you repeat the same climate model over and over, you will have different daily values. So if you play with the initial conditions and you repeat the same climate model, there will be slight differences. And so here is an example of one simulation. So if you have, it shows the mean annual temperature along the latitudinal gradient for one simulation. But if you repeat it many times, well, you could have a second simulation, and this shows a 4-degree difference between one simulation and another. And if you repeat it many times, you could have a lot of possibilities in terms of variation of the future climate. Point is that if you use 5 different climate models, you can get a difference of around 2 degrees. But if you repeat the same climate model over and over, you can have a variation of up to 4 degrees. And this variation is new. It was not really known before. And the reason is it is so computation intensive that a repetition of the same climate model was not actually performed. So it's starting to occur now. And a point, as ecologists, when we work with a climate projection, we actually have no clue of where the simulation stands and the possibility of the model. So were we working with extreme simulations or with kind of mean average simulation? We don't know. And it actually might have impact our interpretation of the result, because if we're working with extreme simulation, we could interpret in certain ways, whereas we could have another interpretation with another simulation. So if the projected mean in annual temperature show as large variations as we saw, like 4 degrees, how large could it be for a daily event that is actually really hard to predict, like frost? So, like I recall, frost can damage the meristems of trees and have impressive impact on tree growth on a plantation. So if we look at the data for the last frost in spring, so by 1960, well, in the past, the last spring frost was expected to occur somewhere between the day of year 120 and 170, and that's between April 30 and June 19. And the difference along the transect is of 53 days. So basically, frost can happen anytime in spring, and it's just very hard to predict. But if we were using the simulation where the last spring frost happened in April 30, we would have likely said that spring frost is not important to trees and would not have any damage. But if we had used the simulation showing that the last spring frost happens in June 19, then we could have said, well, frost is important and could have damaged trees. So the simulation that is used is actually quite important. And by 2090, here's what could be expected. So the variation in the last frost day could be as large as 34 days. So even in a very warming world, our ability at predicting frost remains not so good, and there's a lot of variation in it. So right now we're not really using the full variability in the future climate. Like if we use only a few climate models compared to repeating one climate model over and over, we're not using we're decreasing the amount of variability that could happen in the future. So what is the impact of this intra-model variation in projected last spring frost to tree productivity? So I use an ecophysiological model that predicts budbreak. So it was a very simple model based on growing degree days. And it really was a theoretical simulation where I said budbreak is expected to happen when 300 growing degree days will be reached. And then I looked at the day of year it actually occurred. And I repeated that for every single simulation. And that was to express when budbreak of early leaf-out species could occur. I also used the 500 growing degree day threshold. And this is to express kind of when late leaf-out species could bud break. And if we look at the results in 1960, bud break timings on the y-axis, it's the day of year at which bud break is expected to occur, and there's a difference of 30 days. So basically, if we use many climate simulations, it's very hard to determine when bud break will happen because it could be any time in spring. And by 2090, bud break occurs earlier because climate is warming and we reach 300-degree days earlier, but the variability remains. So even in the future, it's very hard to determine when bud break will happen. And the same is observed for late leaf-out species. So on which day of year will 500 growing degree days be reached? The variability remains as high. So when it's hard to determine when bud break will actually really occur. And if we compare this to the results of 5 climate models, we could see that 5 climate models produce a variability of 14 days. Whereas if you repeat the same climate model 50 times, the variability is of 31 days. So even if we use different climate models, we're reducing the possible variability of the future climate. And so it's not as, well, So what could be expected in terms of exposure to frost? What I did is I actually determined if a frost event was expected once bud break was expected to occur. And I did that for the 300 growing degree days and the late leaf-out species too. And for each simulation, then I did it. And I calculated the percentage of climate simulation that were expecting exposure to frost. And the results are here. And so for the 300 growing degree days, so the early leaf-out species, the results in black showed for the 50 climate realization, and the blue one is for the 5 different climate models. And the percentage is on the y-axis. And we can see that in 1960, there were 80% climate simulation that expected frost damage to trees. But if we go to 2090, then the percentage of climate simulations that are expecting exposure to late frost is actually much lower. It's more around 10%, reaches almost 20%. But this simulation in terms of climate model uses the warmest scenario. So even with the most extreme warming that is expected, we could still see that there could be 20% risk of exposure to frost. So that could be said like a frost every 5 to 10 years in the worst warming scenario. So if we use less warming scenario, we might see more frost damage. So point is, there's a lot of variability and uncertainty that is not accounted for in many climate models and many ecophysiological models. And the more we use climate simulations, and less we actually are able to predict like event like bud break timing. But by then determining a percentage of different climate simulations that are expecting a certain outcome, we might, well, it's kind of a neat way to determine the risk under future climate. So in terms of a kind of broader conclusion, there's a large part of the variability in projected climate that is not accounted for in many models, bud break, but it could be any type of model like carbon sequestration or so point is the internal variability of a climate model is actually important to consider and is kind of a new variable. And interpreting results from simulations should be done with great care, because we don't really know if we're working with extreme simulations or with not extreme simulations, or kind of an average one. So we must have great care when we interpret our results. Thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge all the co-authors and the people I've worked with for this. Thank you.